Okay, our next 40 minutes, we're going to have a panel discussion with some area farmers and talk a little bit about the 2024 cropping season. And to help us do that will be Matt Favre. He's an extension educator at the University of Minnesota, based here in Mankato. And he specializes in crop production. And Matt will lead that discussion for us this morning. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today.
As we're getting set up here, welcome everyone. What a good looking group here for this conference this morning in Mankato. Very nice and toasty in here. Bruce, thanks for the warm introduction. Fairly new extension educator serving crop producers across Minnesota. They gave me an office here in Mankato though. I don't see it too much. You'll never guess who my next door neighbor is. Brad Carlson. Anybody familiar with that wallflower at all? They thought, I think, with like osmosis, all the knowledge in Brad's office would maybe diffuse across the wall and kind of boil into my brain. We'll see if it's working here. So our panel this morning for Nitrogen, Minnesota's Grand Challenge and Compelling Opportunity Conference, is made up of 3 starting members of the local college basketball team, maybe? No, we're all vertically gifted up here, it looks like this morning. I'm sensing some potential with point guards, power forwards, and the like, but don't take my word for it. I was trained up as a wrestler thanks to my father, so we'll get on to that in a second. So we'll introduce our panelists here, and we'll get going. Welcome to everybody again in person online. So we have Tim Malterer from Janesville, Minnesota. We have Jerry Groskreutz. Jerry, you live in Lakeville, but you say your farm's closer to Faribault there. Oh, almost in Iowa. There we go. We'll let you introduce that as well. And AJ Krusemark, you're from the Trimont area. So, gentlemen, welcome. Very excited to have you on this panel. I'll let you guys speak for yourselves here. Please introduce your farming operation and a little bit about the area that your farm is in. I asked you guys if you would indulge me to share one interesting fact about your farm and your background. Thank you.
My name is Tim Malter, farm north of Guardian Energy in Janesville. North of 14 tends to be hilly, so a lot of hills and swales and stuff. And interesting fact, we're 4th generation where we've been at. So
Jerry Groskreutz grew up down by a little town called Wells. That's where the farms are. And my claim to fame is I'm a very big operating farmer because I work land in 3 counties. The home quarter where the dairy was is in Faribault County, and 80 right across the road to the north, that's Waseca County, and 80 half mile to the east, so there's only a quarter section between the home farm and that 80, and that's Freeborn County. So that's my claim to fame. Grew up down there, went to University of Minnesota, got a degree in ag education, and instead of teaching, I went back to the dairy farm, and for 18 years, milked 100 cows and worked 600 acres of land. The fall of '95, I traded the milking parlor in for a radio microphone. Still get up at 3:15 in the morning, but now I go to a studio where it's warm. And a quick note, the difference between being a radio guy and a dairy farmer, it can be 30 below zero in the morning. You get over the farm, you swing through all the buildings, make sure everything's all right, no stock water is froze up. Then you're milking, the vacuum pump started and the parlor wasn't froze up and the skid steer started and the silo unloader started. I go to the studio, get there about 4:15 in the morning if we're off the air, do a couple things, can't get it to work. I send an email to the engineer and the operations manager and I twiddle my thumbs and wait for them to come and fix it.
Hello, AJ Krusemark. We farm and ranch down by Trimont, which is over by Fairmont. We are a century farm, to be our fact. I have 3 little boys that love to help. We farm also with my parents. We have some custom finished pigs around. We have 125 head cow-calf herd that we finish everybody, and we cover crop every acre.
Thank you, gentlemen, for that warm introduction. We can say that your farming chops are certainly preeminent in the farming community, certainly in Minnesota. I've asked you to prepare a few thoughts, and we saw Kenny's presentation a little bit there on past historical events or the climate of Minnesota. So if we throw 2019 out of the window maybe, and we'll get to 2024, there's plenty of meat on the bone there. Think of those years of 2020 to 2023 cropping seasons. A little bit on the drier side, maybe historically, not so much. And what did you learn there? What was working when it comes to nitrogen, especially in your corn production?
So we typically do fall anhydrous on our farm. I guess the things that have been working is getting something out front, coming back and side dressing. We've played around with some double side dressing in the past, a very limited. It didn't work when we came back for the late side dress or additional N in the past. That seemed to not be a profitable case, but fall anhydrous followed by a side dress, and then just trying to manage, usually trying to get to about a pound of N per bushel of corn, and that would be including starters and MAP and any nitrogen credit coming from any application.
Because how I'm the only one here with gray hair. I go way back. I can remember being in high school injecting anhydrous ammonia with a John Deere 4020. And we didn't know a whole lot back then, other than it was cheap and you made sure you got enough on. But we've learned a lot since then, and these last few years, fall anhydrous with a nitrogen stabilizer like N-Serve late. I get the co-op to chisel plow it on because I'm a little preoccupied with farm broadcasting also. And I think maybe 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago, my cousin Chad built a side dress bar, really nice tool bar, fold up wings on the side, 2 big tanks on it with ripple coulters, which I really like because then you could inject it, then you aren't waiting for a rain if you spread urea over the top or liquid nitrogen. Then worked extremely well these last few years, dry years, wet years, until this year.
Our nitrogen practices are, they've changed a bit in the last decade, but for over a decade, we've been doing side dress. We've gone to no fall application unless there's hog manure involved, or a little bit of N that would be in the MAP that we put on with dry. So we put on between 10 and 15 gallons with the planter of 32 and ATS mixed, and then we come back with the side dress pass. For several years we used Coulter, and the last few years we've been primarily wide drop. We are narrow rows, so that gave us a little bit more window and flexibility on timing. There's obviously concerns with that method of application during a dry year. We have found, and I can show pictures, especially in our narrower setup, where a heavy dew is enough to wet the base of that corn plant, and we've had good success getting the nitrogen to pull in with that.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Let's talk about the 800-pound gorilla in the room then, 2024. We'll leave it open-ended. 1 or 2 things that you maybe learned last year when we had a little bit more precipitation than we maybe drew up on the battle plan, right? So no good plan survives its first contact with the battlefield. Let's talk about 2024.
So 2024, obviously super wet. We did our normal practice of fall ammonia and coming back with a side dress application when the corn was V5. Went back out and that corn really didn't look very good. And so we went back out and did some soil nitrate testing. Corn was about V7, V8. Soil nitrate tests were coming back about 6, 7 parts per million. It should have been probably closer to 15 to 20 parts per million. So that told us that there was nothing in the soil. We sampled a number of different practices. We sampled our fall anhydrous. We sampled some fall manure. Did a little bit. We have some acres that are they don't allow us, the state doesn't allow for fall nitrogen application, so we do spring. We sampled those, and all of them said we had lost all of our nitrogen. So then we went back out and did an additional wide drop application. Some got on at V8, some got on at V10, V12 by the time it quit raining. Really saw a super response from that. An extra 30 pounds of N gave us 18 to 20 bushel more corn with that additional side dress. So that was the right decision there. Looking back at total N though, it was a lot. So we typically track our average N per bushel of corn. average comes in about 1. Last year was closer to 1.3 pounds of N per bushel of corn. What we found was really interesting was our top performing acres, our top third performing acres, our efficiency was 1.4 or just over 1. But our poorest performing acres were almost 1.7. So 1.7 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of corn. And as we looked through the maps and looked through the data, on a normal year, our best 30% of our acres are at a 0.8. And so it cost us a little over 0.2 of a pound more N to get that bushel this year on our best acres. But on our poorest performing acres, it took almost 0.4 of a pound. And so we do variable rate nitrogen application at our side dress time, and really found that if we can push our higher performing acres, we get a much higher yield response in our highest performing acres. So that's some of the things we learned this year.
Well, our year was, the major takeaway message is do not allow 25 to 30 inches of rain between late May through June into July. That was my takeaway message for 2024. Been at this for a long time. We put 110 pounds of actual N on in the fall. Co-op did chisel plowed it on with the N serve. And of course, the plan was Cousin Chad would side dress the 12 gallons or so of liquid nitrogen. Well, that wasn't an opportunity because there was water everywhere. So the backup plan gets a little bit bigger. The co-op has higher clearance broadcast equipment. Well, that didn't happen. So now all at once, the corn's not far from tasseling. Looks beyond awful. And now you're struggling with, do you try and side dress some more nitrogen? And now the gut-wrenching decision comes in about crop insurance. And you knew from mid to later on in June for sure, it was probably going to be crop insurance. And so now what you do, and it's horrible to have to give up on the crop, but that's kind of what a lot of us did, because there's no way, no matter what we did, we were going to get close to our guarantee. And I bought up to 90% of my revenue assurance fall harvest option. I added the ice for my individual farm, and given the spring price and what looked like the fall price would be, with no anticipation much of a rally between July and the fall, it looked like I might start collecting crop insurance at just above my trend adjusted yield. But then the other tough part comes in is something, a phrase that the USDA Risk Management Agency refers to as usual or normal customary farming practices. And what was in the back of my mind is if I don't still try and put this this liquid nitrogen on at tassel time, would the crop insurance then come and say you didn't follow normal farming customary practices, so we aren't going to pay you? And so I think, Brad, I was talking to you a little bit about that over at Farm Fest, but in that time frame, I called Jeff Vetch, because I knew Jeff had done a lot of research, and Jeff kind of reassured me that the science is on your side, that the ship sailed, so there's probably nothing you can do. So I didn't do anything else. And you knew most of the summer that it was going to be crop insurance, so you're just trying to plan for the next year, which means control the weeds. And of course, the fungicide application didn't happen. The only way that would have happened is if there was a lot of serious tar spot, and then maybe it would have been worth it to keep the inoculum down in the field. So looking back over this year, the other takeaway message is thinking about all those in my past that started educating me on nitrogen, going way back in the day when I was a student with Dr. Caldwell in agronomy class at the university, and then the Giles Randall and Jeff Vetch and the Brad Carlson and the George Reams, and more recently Dan and Fabian. All you guys get together and say, see, we were right. We told you so, that your nitrate nitrogen was subject to loss with heavy rains in early June and July.
I'd say a couple things stuck out to me this year. One, I'm happy we had been in a pattern of applying the way we had because the growing season for us, by the time the rains had come, we were already in a planning phase of what we're going to do with our nitrogen, and it didn't impact our total plan. That's part of what I like about the side dress pass. We were able to look at more of the year before making that decision, and whether that decision is we're not going to try because it's not going to matter, or we can still push this. You have that opportunity after the crop's out of the ground, and you're able to actually influence your outcome based on the timing of that pass. We have done some custom application. Again, last year, I had a neighbor call, and they had a field that was pretty ugly, and like a lot of folks, that field should have had enough nitrogen on. It had hog manure, it had some 32 with the planter, but it was so wet that a lot of that was not available. We went in and we just did strips in the field, and it was an average of 45 bushel an acre on a 15-gallon application in that field. So that was one field last year, but the point is there are on top of that, the nitrogen uptake of corn, if you look at the profile of when it's taking that nitrogen up and when it needs it, these hybrids are later and later into the season. So that's another reason why we're trying to apply more of that nitrogen closer to that time so that it is plant available and the roots are able to grab it. It's not being chased down and beyond our control. So.
One more thing, you mentioned the hog manure, so I had some experience with that this year with an interesting result because I have a number of pork producers that affectionately poop on me sometimes because I grow sweet corn and peas under contract for Bird's Eye Foods, so I have some land that's available. And one of these cornfields was in August, got 6,000 gallons an acre of finishing barn manure. And then I planted a cover crop of oats and peas, but not oats, oats and tillage radishes, about 1.5 pounds of tillage radishes. And it was so dry that it just laid there until early in September. We caught a rain. It got up about 8-9 inches before it froze off. And that field, I didn't put any other fertilizer on, that 40 acres, just the hog manure. And that field went 150 to 60 bushels an acre, and there was a few acres on the side that was gradually sloped that all the rain shed better without soil erosion. That was pushing close to 200 bushels an acre, and all it had on was that hog manure. So talking to my neighbors, the Bushlocks, that have used a lot of manure over a lot of years, he was questioning that if that hog manure, the nitrogen is readily available as sometimes we think it is, and that it might be a slower release. But that was just an interesting thing that I saw on our farm this year, that the hog manure was magic.
Well, we're running well on the schedule here, so if you guys will bear with me, I might editorialize a little bit on our family farm in Sibley County. So we had one property that, you know, if we think about last year, Jerry, and everyone on the panel here, Tim, AJ, we were all triaging our fields, right? Like which patient needs our attention first and so forth down the line. Had one field that felt was a bit saturated in terms of rooting depth, and you could tell at V8 corn, we had kind of ankle high corn instead of, you know, knee to waist high, right? And so that field, we just did some check strips out there. We did about 20 gallons of liquid nitrogen just prior to tassel. Why not in June, right? Because the research coming out of Waseca and so forth would say go a little earlier, go in late June. Well, we couldn't float a ground rig until July 16th. So that's when we got our 20 gallons of liquid nitrogen, which is about 60 pounds. So we had some test strips out there. We came back, we picked up with the combine and the weigh wagon. Our gain for that was a meager 15 bushels. So we can go from about 145 in a serious situation like that to about 160. So there's just an idea of that return on nitrogen. It's not as good as you, Tim. We're getting only about 1 bushel back for every 4 pounds of nitrogen we put on there in that scenario as a rescue operation. So we totally agree with these uptake patterns of modern hybrids. Most of the damage or the opportunity is there before tassel, right? We still need quite a bit after tassel as well, but we have that kind of cadence with our season. Now across the road, I had a long hybrid maturity plot out there. some 110 plus hybrids. And so I didn't want that to run out of nitrogen, so we did that as well. And our highest yields in that plot were in the low 200s, maybe 200, 210. So that was kind of our upper potential. We had hog manure out there, fall applied. And as we were watching that hog manure applied corn grow, we were seeing these very clear, dark green, lime green strips across the field in the direction that the applicator went in the fall. And you go, huh, something happened with the application there. Well, it was the drag line hose behind the injection applicator. And so we had a very dry fall back in 2023. And so I think we had some nitrogen boil off that year as well. So one learning as well. And then if we jump to another farm that we triaged as looking very good because it had lighter soil and never really sat in saturation. We know that corn and beans do not like wet feet, right? The way to not grow a crop, like we saw in 2024, dump a bucket of water on it in June, then completely dry it out the rest of the year. So this farm, because of the soil profile, a little bit of slopiness, it looked fairly good compared to the neighborhood. And so that farm responded about 100% to a little bit of a later applied nitrogen. And then if we think of our best family ground, we did about 250% better from the worst field we had to the best field. And we'll echo that it took a few more pounds of nitrogen to get to that economic optimum return, right? So the best ground we had this year still needed a bit more nitrogen to get you that really high end yield, just due to some of the loss mechanisms. And then we're making sure we're finishing that season with plenty of nitrogen to really fill that grain out on the cob. So anybody, Jerry, wants to comment on that?
A couple of things I noticed. I planted sweet corn later, got it in the field, and as it started to dry out, then it had the anhydrous in the fall before, and so there was big drowned out spots, but cousin Chad, I had him side dress 12, 13 gallons of liquid nitrogen. So I planted 40 acres in that field, and he side dressed 32. So do the math, 20% of the field was a zero. But you take the tons of sweet corn we got off those 32 acres, we had 8 tons sweet corn. So think what that side dress application in nitrogen did. 8 tons sweet corn where they actually harvested it. 6 ton when you divide by the acres. So that really points out, I think, the value of a side dress application if you can get through the field to get it on. And the other thing, I know we're talking about nitrogen in corn, but the other first time in 48 years I saw this, I was at the studio and I was heading out to farm 35, Highway 14, get to Wasika, take the Snakes Trail and start heading south, and I see whole fields of beans yellow. And I'm thinking, I have a sick feeling, I know what this is. So I get back to the studio, make a couple phone calls, and we saw nitrogen deficiency down there in our soybean fields. Because any available nitrogen volatilized or got washed out through the tile lines, and so super saturated that the legume couldn't even fix its own nitrogen. My agronomist said, I'm going to tell you the same thing I told you back a few years ago when you used it in burners. Just don't look at it for a couple, 3 days, because it was starting to dry out. Next time I went out to farm, beautiful, nice green leaves on the beans. Well, just wanted to throw that in there. The first time in 48 years I saw nitrogen deficiency in soybeans this year. Lucky me.
Excellent. Well, should we close the book on 2024 for now? Please, enough reveling. Okay, so we're optimistic by nature as crop producers, as many in this room know. What can we do to make next year our best year yet? Any changes to our plan? And then let's boil in the responsibility of our retail partners. Can they give us some flexibility to go from fall to spring applied nitrogen? And if we like the idea of a split apply during the year, what sort of flexibility can we offer? We know pre-booking can be a good financial strategy for us in the farm community. What responsibility do retailers have to make us be a little more flexible? So guys, tell us your ideal scenario going into 2025, and we're all going to grow 350 bushel corn.
Yeah, so I guess for 2025, looking at the fall anhydrous is what I did again on some of the acres, but leaning on some of the retail this year, I'm gonna have them spray on 32% with a weed and feed in the spring, as I felt a pretty decent gap there between the fall anhydrous and our side dress last year, so adding in another application there to help with some of that flexibility. And we've kind of chosen to go down the road of we have a sprayer and do our own spraying, but hiring them just from a logistics and time frame to help us timely get that on, and then managing those with the same amount of N, just splitting up those applications more.
Before we totally pass on 2024, going through that last year, just have to say that I was thankful that we have here in southern Minnesota a team around us. When you so get blasted by something that you've never seen before, where there was Jeff Vetch that I could call and say, what do you think I should do? What does research say? And then you got your local agronomists and the seed company agronomists and the University of Minnesota and the extension. So that's the toughest part, I think, of what we do is you got to make the best decision you can at the time, given the information you have. Then the tough part is sometimes you have to wait a few months to find out if it was the right decision. But going for 2025, I'm doing everything the same. I remember discussion, Brad, you and I had over at Farm Fest about how do you plan for 25 to 30 inches of rain pretty much in June? If we're going to plan for that, I might retire and I'll let these younger guys farm for me. But I went with the same plan because I thought I was already doing things right. Maybe sometime in the future I'll go to a double side dress, but put on 110 pounds of actual N on most of my bean ground last fall. One field didn't get done because they started breaking shanks on their chisel plow because the frost was setting in. So they'll spread urea this spring, and I'll get Cousin Chad to side dress 12, 14 gallons of liquid nitrogen. It's worked a lot of years in the past, and from the environmental standpoint, I feel I'm moving in the right direction, and maybe we can figure out other ways to do things more efficiently, but I'm doing the same thing for 2025.
Similar to these guys, our plan is not changing for 2025, but that's because we've already been in a situation where I feel like we're set up to handle 2024. If you aren't in that situation, I know our local co-op now has a side dress rig, or sorry, a strip till rig. We have done spring urea strip till before that has worked very well. But kind of to echo off these guys, the more options you have available and the more conversations you have up front, the more you can work with the retailers and the seed folks, whoever you have in your toolbox. Have some backup plans. Don't expect that whatever we have on our plan right now is going to work, and find a way to get it done. And another thing too for us is there's obviously an economic piece to everything we do, but there is a level of I can't give up on some of the fields. I have to do something. I have to find a way to produce food because there's a lot of hungry mouths that are waiting for that silage and that corn and the cover crop or whatever it is that I'm going to feed the cows. So that's where the flexibility comes into. You find a different way, a different field, pick the best one.
Although I have talked to a lot of farmers, that's one of the fun things that I get to do, get out a lot, and I love talking to farmers, and a number of them that had been putting some form of anhydrous on, doing the right thing later on in the fall with the stabilizer, they said, I'm going to spring urea broadcast. Or I remember one year, going back a few years, sprayed liquid nitrogen over the top right after planting, and that worked great too. But the tough part for me is, boy, it sure is nice because you got a lot of things to do, and to know that it's all there, I can run over the field cultivator and plant it. Versus maybe waiting for the co-op to get to me, even though I watch them spread 80 acres of urea one spring in about an hour. So they can spread a lot of acres in a hurry. And to get ready for this, I didn't even know. So I called my co-op and I said, what is our procedure or policy? Because a lot of years I pay for the anhydrous ahead. And it gets a little dicey with all the different co-ops because mine, I paid for it, I'm going to use it. You don't get it on in the fall, we'll try and get it on in the spring. I've got a ton there credit. But then the dicey part comes if they don't get a lot on, they can't store all of it. It's all, once they got a whole bunch of farmers and all this anhydrous ammonia that they can't store. And my co-op hasn't, he said, ever had to do it that he knew of, but some co-ops will then, won't cancel the contracts. Well, if it change a lot in price, that can be pretty dicey. So that's something to think about. Maybe work with your retailer on what options you do have if you have to go to Plan B or Plan C or Plan D.
Well, and you said that, Jerry, on just in my farming career and seeing what goes on out there, I've seen logistically cause as big a failure with a crop as what form of nitrogen or what's out there. I mean, I haven't seen a whole lot of difference between whether it's spring urea or fall anhydrous. But if that application prevents you from going in the field and just taking the field cultivator out and timely planting a crop, that has seemed to be way more detrimental to guys growing good crops and what kind of nitrogen or what kind of practice they do.
Well, I think we have a very diverse group of growers up here, and everyone's successful taking a little bit different route. And I've also heard the importance of having backup plans, right? Back up to the backup plan, yeah. There are these high water moments in any grower's journey, and I think, for me as well, because of family logistics on our family farm, a little bit of my younger brothers also being busy, we did a little more fall anhydrous leaning on that as well. And so I've kind of also ponied up and invested in a side dress ammonia bar, and that's just something that I think works for our farm in the future. Again, our university research points to the idea of there being many ways to grow corn successfully, right? And to Jerry's point, always lean on our resources and give a call out when you have a question, because they're the experts and they have the data back that we've all invested in to help us answer these questions. So questions, Bruce, how are we going to go about? Okay, we're going to go to the board here. All right, for those that utilize, that one's for Kenny. All right. For those that utilize cover crops, how do you terminate them, and what kind do you plant? For those using manure, how often do you send in manure for nutrient analysis? AJ, would you like to kick this one off? I know you're using some cover crops in your Trimont.
So in our corn and soybean fields, we've tried different mixes. We've gone to using a drill to plant a cereal grain, whether that be wheat, rye, triticale, typically rye or triticale, because we found that's the one that consistently does something for us every year. A few years back, I was concerned about the ability of that grass to give the compaction relief that I was looking for. We had put some in after corn silage that we had taken off when it was wet. The field was very packed and pretty nasty that fall. The next spring, I went out with a soil penetrometer, checked in our strip on one side of the field at home, went across the road into the cover crop after the corn silage. The readings were the same, 150 to 200 pounds to get down to a 9-inch depth. So that told me that the grass is good enough. From a diversity perspective, would I like to use other things? Yes, but functionally in southern Minnesota, following corn and soybeans, we simply don't have enough growing season left to reliably have anything else produce results for us. That's our opinion, our findings on our farm. So that's what we use. We terminate as close to planting or typically after planting is my preferred method. I'll follow the planter around because then I know where that row has been. I can follow the trams from the planter with a sprayer as opposed to driving around in the field. And even with RTK, you're still not always right. You're not in the right place. You don't know where the exact border is. You don't know if the guy in the planter is going to shift over a couple inches because his receiver wasn't set perfect. I find it's just a lot easier, especially on the narrow rows, to follow the planter. Had great success that way. And also using manure, we strip our manure in the fall plant, no matter if it's manure or commercial fertilizer, we're planting directly into fall strips. We've done the drill before and after the strip application. It doesn't seem to make a huge difference. It's not something that we make a decision on logistically. It's a matter of, can you get in the field? Who's got time? get the jobs done. And yes, we do sample our manure every year to make sure that we know where we're at with the application, because rainfall there too, how much rain ran off the roof and got in the pit or whatever it might have been. So it's not so much the consistency of the manure itself year to year, it's how much water did we probably add through runoff.
My experience with cover crops is only following the canny crops. Got into, I think, 5, 6 years ago, because it just didn't seem right. The peas come off later on in July, middle of July. It's a little too late to think about trying to plant beans, and it just didn't seem right to have a black field out there, or just spraying it and having some dead weeds out there. So I like to keep it simple, tandem disc it, and last year, because I was busy and it's hard to borrow spinner spreaders and know exactly what you're doing from the co-ops. They don't like those. They want to use their big fancy ones. And I had 40 acres also of prevented plant on the oats, or on the beans. So I had 160 bushels of oats to round up, and that's a lot of bags. And I'm not as young as I used to be. And I get my certified oat seed as a cover crop. And I go up to Werner Farm Seed at Dundas because it's a oat variety that didn't sell very well. Or maybe it had rust problems, so people didn't want it. So I get to buy it cheap, and they're in 50-pound bulk totes, and he runs them up into the truck, take them out to the farm and lift up the hoist and run it into the airflow. And then I also plant about 1.5 pounds of tillage radishes, because they are fantastic at, it looks like a gigantic carrot with a long taproot. And I talked to another guy that grows sweet corn and peas for Bird's Eye Foods. And just imagine semi-tractor trailer sitting out on the edge of your field or in a little bit as a cart comes to dump into the semi to take back to the plant. And he wasn't seeing any compaction because of those tillage radishes. So they airflow it on, and it's about getting done fast. So I go out with a field cultivator and set your shovel so they just barely touch the ground. Then you have the tines in the back, so you run over it. You get a rain, and it grows like crazy. And because it's oats and tillage radishes, they aren't perennials, so Mother Nature terminates it for me. And we're among friends here. So this fall, the cover crop was about 1 foot tall last summer first. And there's 3 great big farrowing barns 1/2 mile from this field. And my neighbor called up and said, could we put finishing bar manure on your cover crop? And I said, gee, we've never done it in standing cover crops. I could show you the picture. Couple weeks, you didn't even know it. And all you saw was a knife slit down where that injector went and where the quad went pulling the big toolbar. We injected 12,000 gallons an acre. And he was happy as a lark because it was only 1/2 mile down the road, so he could drag line it. And those oats got up to my chest. So here's where we need to keep a secret, because my friends at SWCD weren't very happy that I went out with a stalk chopper and chopped it down, and then went out with a tandem disc to try and get a little bit of black dirt up, because this field's going to be corn next year. Corn doesn't like residue, that much residue. So that's my experience with cover crops after candy crops, which is an ideal opportunity over the struggles of trying to get something going in corn and soybeans.
All right, we are out of time. These gentlemen, I think, will be around today, so grab them for further questions and conversation. So it's been Tim Malterer, Jerry Groskreutz, AJ Krusemark. Please join me in thanking them for being on our panel today.